Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Today, World Speech Day and World Values Day have joined forces to host a panel discussion to explore the issue of domestic violence as a part of the World Speech Day Women International Women's Day virtual event 2023. According to the United Nations, domestic violence or intimate partner violence can be defined as a pattern of behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions that have an influence over another person. We have a brilliant panel offering different perspectives on this matter. Today we have Rajendra Maharajan, who is the country coordinator for Right Here, Right Now, working in sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people in Nepal. We have Dr. Bettina Baobang Baidu, who is a South African medical doctor, debate coach, motivational speaker, and author currently pursuing a master's degree in public health. We have Carmen Martinez Vargas, who is a transdisciplinary scholar and author of Democratizing Participatory Research, Pathways to Social Justice from the South. Of course, we have Simon Gibson, who is a writer, speechwriter, and founder of World Speech Day. And last but not least, we have Charles Fowler, who is the global coordinator for World Values Day. In addition to being involved with two other UK-based NGOs, in addition to World Values Day, these organizations also focus on values. I am Vino Pillai. I am the global lead for World Speech Day Women and your moderator for today. I want to start off by giving Simon and Charles the floor to share why they think this topic aligns with the mission of their respective organizations. Charles?
Yes, I'll start. Yes, thank you very much indeed, Vino. And welcome to everyone. Just to say very quickly, World Values Day, as its name may suggest, aims at increasing the awareness and practice of value around the world. And the World Values Day started as a campaign about 8 years ago. And over time, we've become increasingly interested in looking at the big issues facing the world, which challenge the awareness and practice of values, which are challenges to our values, the inherent values, if you like, the intrinsic values, human values, whatever you like to term them, that we overwhelmingly share around the world. And we've been looking at big issues. With World Speech Day, we looked a few months ago at the refugee crisis, the global refugee crisis. We've also been looking recently, as World Values Day, at addiction, the addiction crisis around the world, at mental health crisis around the world, at war generally, at the issues to do with environmental sustainability. And so we're really pleased to join you all in looking at this particular extremely big and serious issue facing us all, which, quite apart from all the pain and suffering, is clearly a challenge to our values, and an invitation really for us to see how values can play a part in addressing these issues. That's our point. That's our perspective, my perspective on this issue. Obviously, the perspective of others will be rather different. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Charles. Well, one of the great pleasures of recent times for me has been watching World Speech Day Women grow and blossom, and in particular the vivid events that Vino hosts on International Women's Day, which are a real highlight. The reason Charles and I set up these talks was to review certain important and contemporary topics, but from a global perspective. Very often we felt that these topics, these subjects were being talked about, but also mainly from a national or indeed even local level. And maybe there's something to be gained, maybe something to be learned from looking at things from a global perspective. So that was one of our main reasons for setting them up. And the second reason was that we felt that very often the things which are in plain sight, the things which are often discussed in the media and in conversations, are actually often the least well understood. That for the very reason that we talk about them, sometimes we don't know maybe the fuller facts, a better understanding. And so these brief talks are aimed at kind of developing our understanding and bringing out issues which I'm sure that fabulous range of speakers this morning will be able to add to. So I'm here as a witness, as a listener, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you will have to say. And I'm very, very grateful that you're all here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, both Simon and Charles. I think it's good for us to see exactly how this feeds into our discussion today. So I think we're going to dive right in. We're starting with Rajendra. Rajendra, what do you believe is the extent of domestic abuse, and is there reliable data on the scale of domestic abuse around the world?
Thank you, Vino, for the question. I think the problem of domestic intimate partner abuse is widespread and has been affecting millions of people around the world. So according to the World Health Organization, globally, 1 in 3 women have experienced either physical or sexual abuse by their intimate partners. So let me give an example of Nepal. The study was conducted in 2015, and that study shows that the prevalence is much higher, which is around 70% of women have experienced either physical or sexual or psychological abuse by the partner. And the study also shows have shown us that the main cause of death and disability has been the reason of this intimate partner violence in Nepal. So this is also the similar with around the world and the global. Unfortunately, the reliable data on the scales of violence is not available the way we wanted. It might be because of many countries globally do not have a proper effective system to collect data and report such cases. And also the survivors, especially women, they are not empowered enough to be there at the authorities to report such cases and their experience they had from their partners. So it can be said that it can be concluded with the remarks that the actual abuse or violence or incidents of partner violence is likely much higher than that has been reported.
Okay, right. And then what are your views on the most worrying trends, both nationally and globally for you?
Thank you again. So one of the worrying thing is the unreporting of the cases. So as I mentioned earlier, women, especially women and other survivors of intimate partner violence, they are not being able to report cases. So it might be because of stigma. It is associated with the same. It is also associated with the fear of retaliations from their partner. It is also associated with the systems that are in place where they're survivor friendly, where they have such spaces where they can have confidential spaces to share their or report those cases. And second is lack of resources and the support services. So in terms of resources, many countries, including Nepal, they have very limited resources allocated for survival and their support. So in the support system also they lack shelter, psychosocial support for the survivals. They also need legal aid support, especially the women in rural places like Nepal, where they need different kinds of support when they face such experience or they face abuse from the partner. But there lacks such support system. There lacks the resources for themselves to be there to report such cases. And other worrying thing is the access to finance for the women and financial dependency to their intimate partner, especially women in South Asia. They are more dependent to their husbands for finance, or even they want to buy small stuff, household stuff. They have to depend or ask their husband. So that leads to increase in violence in the family. And also those harmful social norms and practices that we have been practicing for a long time, where we practicing patriarchal belief, patriarchal norms and values, where we have taught everyone that men are superior, and that's why women do not require respect, or they can be abused. So that kind of belief that has been developed from generations, that is very worrying element for ending such violence. And also the legal protection system that are in countries, they are also worrying because of there is lack of a protection system. There is lack of legal supporters that can support survivors, especially women, and even though they face risks from such supporters sometimes. So these are the few areas or the things that we need that are worrying to challenge intimate partner abuse and violence.
Sure. Okay. So I'd like to move on to Bettina now. Bettina, why has abuse become so prevalent in society? What do you think are the main drivers of abuse?
Thank you so much, Rena. Thank you for having me on this panel today. I think it's such an important discussion that we are having about domestic abuse. And as Simon mentioned, the conversation needs to evolve. And I think the more we speak about it, the more we allow for that evolution and finding gaps in what we don't know, what we need to research more on, and how we can create a situation or a circumstance in which all women are protected. So in terms of the drivers of abuse, I always want to preface a discussion about drivers with the idea that even though we identify risk factors and things that make individuals prone to domestic abuse, it is not all inclusive. I think sometimes focusing on drivers makes individuals who don't identify with those risk factors less willing to report abuse because they don't think abuse can happen to them or should happen to them. So even though we're discussing drivers of abuse as a way to understand what we need to respond to in society, it's not all inclusive, and anyone can be a victim of abuse in society, regardless of their circumstance and their situation. I think that's important to say from the get-go. I think it's also important within the conversation about domestic abuse to define the areas we're talking about. So domestic abuse is encompassing of interpersonal violence and interrelational violence between partners, but it also encompasses abuse towards children, abuse towards the elderly as well. So any kind of abuse that happens in a domestic setting, we would consider to be domestic abuse, and factors and driving factors towards abuse also need to look at other kind of relationships that happen. So relationships between parents and children, and relationships between caregivers to elderly individuals in their family settings. So with that said, then, interrelational violence, interpersonal violence, especially amongst women and men, is the most prevalent, and factors and information that we have about drivers of abuse is more common in that area. And those drivers consist of, first of all, education. So it has been found that women completing specifically secondary education are less likely to experience abuse than women who haven't completed their education. So socioeconomic standards as well. So women living in lower socioeconomic standards being more prone to abuse and prone to domestic violence as well. It's also been associated with substance abuse. So individuals who live in a house where somebody suffers from substance use disorder are more likely to also be victims of domestic abuse. Another really, really important one is individuals who have witnessed violence growing up, as well as previously have been victims of violence themselves. I think that's such an important one when we speak later about how do we react and respond to violence, because we know that in circumstances where somebody has seen or witnessed violence as a child, our psychosocial services need to come in place in order for us to be able to prevent that kind of behavior from being initiated or created again when they grow up or in their lifetime. Another really important element of it, as Rajendra also pointed at, is the dependency that individuals have. So the financial circumstances of women, do they have access to other economic opportunities? And that's a really important driver in terms of them staying in abusive circumstances and not being able to be free from those abusive circumstances. And that's because domestic abuse is such a complex social phenomena that it's really difficult to have one type of solution that speaks to it holistically, because of these wide range of driving factors that that lead to it and that influence it. But I think for the most part, those would be the kind of identified driving factors that are that are commonly spoken about in the literature.
I think you touched on something that we don't often focus on, the elderly, and that is something that's so important for us to consider and to have conversations about. But then what about social media and digital media and the impact that has in terms of abuse? What can you say about that?
Yes, I think it's a very dual conversation, and I think most large bases or institutions that are used by a lot of people will have mixed responses in terms of, is it good or bad for domestic violence. So in the one instance, domestic violence and social media has been useful in terms of creating awareness about what domestic violence is, creating awareness about solutions that women can have in being able to escape circumstances, NGOs that they can reach out to. So social media platforms being used by most people in the world, people spending large amounts of their time on social media platforms, is a great place and a great space to create awareness, to have the conversation. The Me Too movement that really ignited conversations about domestic violence, about gender-based violence in our modern society. So on the one end, there have been really great positives from social media in terms of being used by activists and used by people to create awareness and to make individuals aware of solutions they can have to being or to escaping those circumstances. On the other end, social media has also opened up other forms of domestic violence that are important to consider and that are important for us to move forward. It has made it easier, for example, for an individual to be stalked by an intimate partner. So social media stalking that happens on those platforms being a new form of domestic violence that we need to consider, made it easier for emotional violence and verbal abuse to occur towards individuals in the homes, which is harder to escape than leaving a physical environment, because social media means that somebody can access you from different places, even if they aren't directly next to you. And that has expanded the type of abuse that we can see from different places. But as Rajendra also spoke to, what we consider to be masculine, what we consider to be feminine. And even though social media has challenged those ideologies, in some instances, it can also reinforce what we think is masculinity. In South Africa, we have a very, very popular saying called "Indoda must," which means like, this is what we expect of a man. And those kind of conversations that commonly happen, reinforce ideas that the man needs to be the financial bearer, needs to look after a person, reinforces ideas of blesser culture, where younger women are looking for older relationships in which abuse is also found to be more prevalent and more common. So social media can also reinforce those kind of stereotypes and those ideologies that make violence more likely.
Interestingly, both the good and evil of social media shows us how values are interwoven even in how we use social media and the impacts of it, as gauging by your answer right now. So this brings us to Carmen. Carmen, what sorts of abuse do you believe are most overlooked or are not recognized by most of us?
Thank you. Thank you for that question and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today discussing with all of you. And it's been a pleasure to listen to my colleagues here today in the panel. Certainly, we can say that all type of abuse has been overlooked. all of them from physical to psychological to sexual and economic that are often the one referred to. I say this because, of course, depending on the context, some of them are more prevalent than others. And certainly the physical and the sexual has been historically the ones that are more visible for international organizations. But obviously, I think there is a challenge to see the psychological and economic in a more kind of long-term perspective. Because, as I said, the sexual and the physical is an action, and it's an action that is taken and is like resolving that action. But the psychological and the economic, it goes long term, and there are implications. That is something that Bettina was commenting on about intergenerational violence passing from one generation to another. And I think that is really key at the moment in terms of breaking cycles of abuse in many countries, besides the more visible or physical violence that we experience. And I think, of course, this is connected to collectives in terms of intersectional profiles, which has been said by my colleagues. Because we tend to assume that gender violence is only against this kind of ideal profile of a young woman with kids, small kids, right? And it's not. It's really not. And we forget about the intersections, like we were mentioning about elderly women, about LGBTQI plus collectives. And all these kind of intersections that situate these collectives being more vulnerable to this kind of violence. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Carmen. Well, back to you, Rajendra. In terms of the work that you do and the exposure you have had, what sort of stories have you heard firsthand which brought home to you the seriousness of this problem, or has demonstrated how abuse can be ignored or deliberately overlooked by those in power?
Thank you. So let me share an incident that happened on 29th January, which is very recent, when a man named Bhanu Bika set his wife and 2-year son on fire and escaped. And the authorities, especially the police, are still searching this guy. So another incident happened in 2022 around November, where a woman of age 27 to burn herself in front of her ex-fiance, where the fiance asked this woman to break the relations they have or the engagement they had. So such incident is happening in Nepal and other countries around the world. So that such incidents or such crucial or critical incidents has demonstrated the urgency of addressing domestic abuse in Nepal and around the world. So it also shows the need for great support for survivors. So especially the woman who burned herself in front of her fiancé. So she could have been saved if she were provided with proper counseling on time and provided counseling with the sharing that the breaking up with the relation is fine. She could start new relationships, or she could have found better men, better person in future. But that lack of that support system within family, within community, and within the structure itself has led to happen such incidents. And it's also crucial for authorities and policy makers who need to take this issue very seriously and effectively implement the policies and laws they already have in place. Like in Nepal, we have Domestic Violence Act 2019, but it has not been implemented effectively, and people have less aware of this act in place, and they are not aware of what to do when they personally experience such incident. So back in few years back, also there was an incident of rape of 16 years old by her partner, and it had because the guy and the family has good relations with the police, local authorities, and it was dismissed. The case was dismissed within the few days, and all the evidences of rapes were disappeared. And the case is still on. Lots of NGOs and civil society organizations raise voice to challenge or to take that guy in custody. But that power, having relations with these authorities, make them easier to dismiss those cases. So the case is still on, but it is taking longer time, and it has not been authorities and police has not been able to capture that guy. Still, he is still running around and in the community, and maybe taking advantage of another adults and girls. So that issue, that seriousness had to be taken care by the authorities, also families and community as a whole.
Thank you, Rajendra. Bettina, in terms of efforts to address domestic abuse, can you think of any real-life examples of initiatives, and can you offer evidence to support these strategies that have been put into place?
Thank you so much. And I think maybe I want to speak about this from the perspective of public health. So working in the public health space and as a public health practitioner, I think some of the solutions that are really important and why public health is coming into the forefront in relation to domestic violence, the recognition that domestic violence, especially in South Africa, is a threat to the well-being of the lives of women. So in 2009, 59% of homicides that were, inflicted on women were caused by an intimate partner, and that's a critical number, which means more than 1 in 2 women that are dying by homicide or dying because of an intimate partner. And if we're going to talk about health, and health in its most holistic definition being the well-being of an individual, both mentally, socially, and physically, then domestic violence is a critical threat to the health of individuals. And I say this because as we're talking on this issue of values and world values initiatives, the health system needs to be a value-driven institution. It's values that shape what we think is important to respond to. It's values that shape what we prioritize in terms of resource allocation, what we prioritize in terms of initiatives. And we saw this with the HIV/AIDS epidemic in South Africa, that when our values aligned with the need to respond to it, South Africa is one of the most robust HIV/AIDS response systems ever. Solutions are possible. And I think at a point where we think of something and make it too complex and we think that solutions aren't possible, our values don't align. So I think first of all, when we're looking at solutions, we need to realign and reorientate all our systems outside of public health towards understanding that responding to domestic violence and gender-based violence is essential, and that every system in society needs to be responding to it. The education system, the public health system, all need to have this as a forefront of their solutions. With that said, then, I think public health is so essential because victims of violence, especially physical violence, practitioners are the first point of call in most instances that individuals will come to, whether or not they faced sexual abuse and they want to receive services for that sexual abuse, or whether or not they're physically harmed and they're there for those reasons. If practitioners are not well equipped to be able to refer patients to the correct places, to be able to start these conversations, we lead to a situation where we're going to just be reinforcing this violence over and over again. So as a first line response, we need to ensure that our public health systems are configured towards domestic violence and towards ensuring this. And the World Health Organization has an entire policy brief on how governments can reorganize their public health systems to be responsive to domestic violence and recognizes the role of public health in that response. Second of all, I think we need to recognize that domestic violence is so tied to issues we've been speaking about, so tied to mental health services, which are a catastrophe in the African health system, which are not focused on and receive almost no funding. We can't respond to domestic violence if people can't get treatment for trauma they've experienced as children, if people can't get treatment for substance use disorders, if people can't get treatment for depression. None of that can happen until we're able to really invest and prioritize mental health services as a necessity within this nation. That's how we start to challenge the intergenerational causes of violence at a point where we can give people access to those resources and abilities. And lastly, I think we need to look into these ideas of shelters, the places that individuals who have been affected by violence go to. If we look at the history of domestic shelters in South Africa, it's really is very complex and also quite sad because these shelters have received such little support. And these shelters are an important place for women to go to receive access to financial resources and ability to break out of those systems. And we need to reinvest again in shelters, reinvest again in these places of refuge. But all of this ties into creating a system that prioritizes and allocates resources towards those solutions. I think that's how we can start moving forward in addressing domestic violence.
I think you've given us such incredible solutions to this issue, but the fact that domestic violence is so prevalent, it's because there are still obstacles. What are some of the obstacles that you can pinpoint?
So I think those obstacles also speak to what I was mentioning prior. So the obstacles in relation to our mental health services, the obstacles in relation to people's ability to access shelter and access, a reprieve from violence itself. Because the issue with domestic violence is that 1 in 5 women have already experienced domestic violence or are in a circumstance where violence is happening. It's the recurring nature of violence that we also need to speak into to prevent individuals who are already facing violence from facing future violence. And in a situation where women aren't economically independent, it's very difficult for them in these intimate partner relationships to find other alternatives or to be able to leave. So when we are able to reconstruct and look at our domestic shelters, what can they offer women? What kind of options can they give women? Can we reorientate them away from just being about women coming and staying for a period of time and leaving again to a system in which they're actively being rehabilitated, actively being given skills and the ability to break out of that situation? And I think overall, in terms of what's been preventing us from moving forward, I think it's our cultural understandings as well, and the ways in which we relate to each other. I think we'll always come back to conversations about our constructs of gender, our constructs of masculinity, and needing to speak into that, needing men to really confront their vision, their ideas of what masculinity is, and how then we are able to break out of that and break out of those cycles.
Absolutely. Carmen, what is your view on this? What are the biggest obstacles in your view to tackling domestic abuse?
I completely agree with Bettina. I guess in the academy, we cannot agree on this, right? So depending on the different disciplines, one will say one aspect and the other will say another. And I guess perhaps something that is overlooked is this kind of systematic and more structural aspect of domestic abuse and gender-based violence, in the sense that it's a crisis of values of our society, and is Victorian patriarchal values that has been fostered and reshaped within neoliberal societies, and therefore, continue to be part of how our gender relations work within societies. And especially here, referring Western societies and societies that are somehow following a kind of model of being a human being and being a collective society. So I think for me, it's quite important to highlight this link between the past and the present in the formation of these values. So we understand that these dynamics are not coming out of the blue, but they have been formed and reshaped by economic values in the last centuries. And the issue with the economic values is that because of neoliberal values, it exacerbated the position of women within the society. And we have come to a point in where we can reclaim as women economic freedoms, but somehow we get stuck within power relations, and therefore, we see consequences or the outcomes of these dynamics as domestic abuse and gender-based violence. So I think for me, and coming back to the discussion and the points at the beginning, one of the biggest obstacles is to not recognize the values that we use to function as society, and they are there because many people believe that we are not normative in the way that we behave, that we are not, or we are ethically driven, and these ethics or moral behaviors are somehow magically situated for the good. And unfortunately, we see throughout history that good intentions is never enough. And our values are producing consequences that are oppressing other collectives and other communities unintentionally. And therefore, we need a real critique of what neoliberal and modern values are and how they are impacting domestic abuse and gender-based violence.
Okay. So, Rajendra, it's a well-known fact that national and international governments and agencies play a pivotal role in addressing abuse. How can you comment on this? Well, what do you believe that that national and international governments and agencies are doing to address this issue?
Yeah, agreeing with previous panelists about changing gender norms and access to finance. So these are the two important key factors that needs to be addressed, and also the root cause of domestic abuse that has been happening. So government or international NGOs and NGOs, so this needs to work collectively to address those root causes and identify those root causes. So that can be different from country to country, and within the country it can be different from context to context, one community from other community. So then we need to come together and we need to create a cohesiveness and create a partnership between government and organizations at different levels that can start from local, national and international level to understand or identify those key root cause of domestic and intimate partner violence, and design and develop programs and policies that can address those root cause. So it can be done by legislative reforms. So in different countries now they have been abide with different international commitments to end gender-based violence and independent partners. Many countries have developed policies and programs and acts, but in terms of implementation, there has been some lacks in implementations. So government, international organizations, agencies, or NGOs can provide technical support for government where they lack some understanding on dealing those issues. Then they can come together to reform such policies and programs. We can also, as agencies, we can increase awareness raising campaigns at online and offline spaces. So at this digital age, there has been we can use of different increase awareness. So in terms of Nepal, we have 70% internet penetration in Nepal. Almost 90% uses a smartphone. So we can use such technologies to increase awareness. So we can. So there can be, we can initiate a hotline service in partnership with the government where survival can only give or connect with free of cost to report the cases. And there is providing with support system, including shelter, counseling, and legal aid. So we can also provide some support, service support where we can, so one of the best example in Nepal is safe houses, so initiated by different organizations, led by women department. And in that safe houses, it is supported by different organizations like UNICEF, WHO, and in that spaces, survivals can stay there as long as they feel safe. And they also provide legal aid support and counseling support there. So such support system also can be built by agencies like us. And we can also provide support on providing capacity strengthening to the survival general public as a whole, and also to the service providers like female health workers, health legal aid providers, where we can strengthen the capacity to increase their understanding about the abuse and how they can provide support for the survivors. So then finally, we can also, so as I mentioned earlier, we do not have reliable sources to scale the domestic violence and abuse. So as agencies, we can also come up to support in data collections, research, to identify the actual scenario in terms of abuse, and generate evidences for government to advocate and support government to challenge and to work against the partner abuse.
So I think we can agree that national and international governments and agencies play a critical role in terms of legislation, policies, programs, and financial and infrastructural support. But Carmen, what do you think we as individuals can do to address this issue?
Thank you for that question. And I think it's a tricky question, right? Because here we're assuming that as individuals, we have power, to fight against the structures. And it's not that I disagree with agency and the point of, seeing the potential of having some agentic actions. But I think we need to be conscious that here we're dealing with a structural issue. So this is kind of a collective responsibility that we need to carry. And when we carry this responsibility, we have to be careful not to re-victimize the victims, telling them as individuals that they have to, help to fix the problem because they were the victims, or because they so feel strong about, fighting those things. And I think that's why it's a tricky question. But besides that, what we see is that obviously when structures and institutions are failing us, the only way that we can prompt some change is through grassroots movements, and that's what we've been seeing, right? Like different movements, different non-for-profit organizations, trying to push the agendas and lobby to make this a priority, so it becomes institutionalized in a way that is effective. Because I think at this point we have it somehow institutionalized, the issue, but it's not effective yet. And the complexity in which it's represented in the practices of different societies is really complex, and therefore it's not being tackled in the different ways that need to be done. So I think at the individual level, we have to, of course, be careful not to victimize victims about fighting against gender-based violence. But for those who were privileged enough, like for instance us, to have the resources and the abilities to access these resources, we can somehow, be part of this push and support of organizations. And this tackles any gender, any class, any kind of collective. But yeah, we have to understand again that this is a structural issue. And I think as such, we have to somehow do not we're resolving intergenerational issues, and we need, generations and education and resources to deal with this in the long term. Of course, we have the agency and the localities and the context in which we operate, but we have to also see this in a bigger picture. That this is something like sustainability in the long term in terms of gender-based violence.
And I think we cannot underestimate the power we have as individuals and as citizens. I can give you two examples. World Speech Day Women, it was in 2020, we had a digital literacy campaign during the 16 days of activism. And in an effort to protect, survivors and victims of gender-based violence, we didn't feature any of them. But instead, we have a very wide WSD community supported mainly by the university students, and they stood up as advocates, offering digital literacy tools to combat online violence. And I think that's one example. Another example here in South Africa was in 2018, we had the Global Citizen Campaign and Festival. And that campaign gave us as South African citizens an opportunity to participate in actions that were directed at various governments to change policy and legislation and so on by taking action online through various pledges. So, you know, the opportunities are actually at hand for us to get involved and to speak up in whatever small way. We don't have to do big things. It's just, you know, small actions can take us a long way. So this brings me to Rajendra again. Rajendra, what areas do you think we most urgently need to change in terms of changing attitudes towards abuse?
Thank you for the question. Again, there are different and several areas towards where attitudes towards domestic abuse needs to be changed. So as Carmen mentioned about victim blaming, so we have attitudes of blaming victims itself for the incident that had happened to them. So everyone has to understand that it is not there. It is not they wanted to have that incident to happen, and they are not responsible for that abuse that had happened to them. So we need to change that attitudes to blaming victim itself. So I can still remember my mother's school blaming my sister when she had a fight with her husband a few years back. So that attitudes where we blame victim itself has to be changed. And also, we have been discussing the gender roles and stereotypes since beginning of this discussions, where we need to understand the power relationship within the community, within the nations, and we need to challenge that, and we need to change the attitudes where we feel that men are superior and women are not. Women should not be given priority in decision-making process. So we can adopt gender transformative approach that has been practiced in different countries, where we understand power relations and do different transformative approach. We need to understand the inclusivity and intersectionality approach, where we challenge that gender norms and stereotypes and takes actions against them. So we as a people also have attitudes of normalizing abuse and violence, and especially I can take the examples of Nepal and South Asia, where the women are taught by the elders saying that husbands are like God, and you must tolerate any kinds of abuse or violence that happen to you, and you should not take any actions against your husband because that person is like God. And there is a special word in Sanskrit that use Pati Parmeshwara, which means husband or God. So that kind of the lessons that kind of norms that has been practiced in countries or communities in individuals, that attitudes needs to be challenged and changed by the individual itself. And also the law enforcement, where we can feel that there is lack of political will of the policymakers and the the authorities, where they want to challenge or they want to take actions on ending those such violence. So we need to work together to increase political will of those that are in the decision-making table. We need to challenge that there needs to be women in the decision-making table. There needs to be young people. There needs to be LGBTIQ community in the decision-making table to share their own story and demand what they need to abuse and violence they have been facing for a long time.
I think, Rajendra, it's very encouraging to see the younger generation challenging what we saw as normal, especially not necessarily with my generation, but the older generation. The example that you used, about not challenging the husband or accepting blame when something goes wrong. It was so much, the norm. I think many of us would never have questioned that growing up, but we know differently now, and I think it's very, very encouraging to see that for the younger generation, they challenge all of this. They challenge these norms. So this brings us close to the end of our panel discussion, and I'd like to give Simon and Charles an opportunity to reflect on the discussion and to comment. Let's start with Charles.
Thank you, Veena. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Often it's tempting to admire the discussion and feel even more overwhelmed after listening to it by the scale of the problem. But I think it's probably no surprise to us that the problem is very, very complex, deeply rooted in society, all our societies around the world. And it's easy to, in a way give up and think, well, what can we do to help? However, so many things are being done on the ground, and we've heard quite a lot of them from all the speakers. Thank you so much for sharing what you've been doing and your analysis of what needs to be done. I think the takeaway I have from this is that structural changes are needed, but structural changes need to be prompted by and accompanied by a change in attitudes in our societies, because governments will only respond really, one has to say, to the pressure, to the opinion, to the attitudes of the people whom either elect them or at least to whom they are in some way responsible to, depending on the structure of the government and the structure of the country. And I thought it's really heartening to hear that there are things we can do. And I think, as ever, technology brings big problems with it, and in some ways has exacerbated this particular one, but also may provide some help towards resolving, or at least addressing, not resolving, sadly, probably for a long, long time, but addressing the problem by giving us a mechanism for changing generally public attitudes gradually over time. And hopefully this particular discussion is one way that we can help do just that. So thank you so much. I'm really, really happy to have heard this very, very powerful and useful discussion. And I found it very moving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Simon?
We can't hear you, Simon, I think.
It would help if the host turned his microphone on, of course. I think the first thing that comes to mind really is that there's so much to think about and to talk about and to take away and think about and reflect on. So I haven't got an enormous number of immediate remarks to make. It seems to me, however, that there are a number of things which are in common and that all of you comment about, such as intergenerational violence and socio-economic conditions which drive so much of domestic abuse, and that's understandable. But also the fact that context is everything, and it's a danger to approach things from a sort of generalization where context and individual circumstances are the most important, and those change culturally. And we've seen that in various different speakers. And the thing that occurred to me most when I was listening to you was that we define ourselves through our relationships. Relationships give us a sense of self. And many of these problems, it seems to me, come out of that notion of self. And when we feel it's either threatened or and somehow endangered. And I think therefore, that it is a matter of raising this on a sort of societal level, that we need to talk about things, we need to speak about them, to raise them, and to give people confidence to approach and care about it. And therefore, speaking out and talking about these subjects is an extremely important part of mending them. That it isn't going to be, however effective, institutions or governments or indeed even the law that really changes things, but social attitudes, social values, which will alter things. And just as Bettina mentioned, the change in the attitudes towards AIDS in South Africa, that was a societal change, because people understood more, people taught more, and people started to care more. And therefore, I think that's what I will take away from this, to think about how we can spread conversations about this subject and really do so from a point of view that we can make a difference, even just by sharing our thoughts. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think it was a wonderful way for you and for Charles to bring this discussion to a conclusion. But I would like to, as World Speech Day Women is a United Nations Women Generation Equality Commitment Maker, I'd like to conclude by mentioning the United Nations International Women's Day 2023 theme, which is digital innovation and technology for gender equality. So whilst our discussion covered various aspects of domestic violence, I think one of the things that it did reinforce is how essential it is to bridge the digital gender divide with respect to eliminating the deficits in the production, availability and accessibility of data, evidence and stats on gender-based violence, so that proper legislation, policies and programs to address violence in women and girls are developed and implemented. This will also aid in increased awareness of and access to coordinated survivor-centered services. And in this vein, I would like to thank all of you for your contribution today. I'd like to thank Charles Fowler and Simon Gibson for the opportunity to collaborate and as such strengthen our efforts to advocate for the purposes of promoting gender equality and working towards a better world. But very importantly, and last but certainly not least, I want to thank Rajendra Mahajan, Bettina Baobeng Baidu, and Carmen Martinez Vargas for your contribution today. I think you have brought unique perspectives geographically and in terms of your expertise. So thank you all once again.